Joe Banks is a middle-aged man living in Staten Island, New York. His life at first sight seems unremarkable, filled with gray everyday life and endless workdays. He works as a clerk in a boring factory that produces some small goods. The work process does not attract him in any way, and his boss, Frank Vaturi, is a rather unpleasant man who constantly expresses his displeasure to Joe and demands from him the impossible. The atmosphere at work is so depressing that Joe feels helpless and apathetic. His life becomes a routine from which he sees no escape. He continues to go to work day in and day out with no hope for anything. For a long period of time, Joe feels physically unwell. He suffers from headaches, fatigue, and weakness. He regularly visits doctors, but all examination results turn out to be normal. The doctors cannot find any diseases that could explain his condition. He is tired of constant unsuccessful attempts to find the cause of his pains, and his ailments begin to remind him of a kind of curse that he is forced to live with without knowing the cause. One day Joe goes to see Dr. Allison, who unexpectedly gives him a diagnosis that turns his life upside down. The doctor informs him that Joe has a rare condition called brain cloud. This disease is nearly asymptomatic, yet fatal. Although outwardly he appears healthy, the disease is slowly destroying his body. The doctor explains that Joe does not feel direct symptoms, as the disease is psychosomatic, and is probably caused by the stress that has accumulated in his life. Joe also mentions that he was once a firefighter, and in that job he may have suffered an injury that caused his current condition. The doctor informs Joe that Joe will not live beyond 5-6 months and that he should spend his remaining days well. This news comes as a real shock to Joe. Suddenly his life, which seemed meaningless and monotonous, takes on a new, tragic reality. Joe then feels that his existence is doomed and decides that something has to change, even if his life is coming to an end. He can no longer continue working in the factory, doing monotonous work that brings him neither joy nor satisfaction. He decides to quit and never go back there ever again. He goes to his boss Frank Vaturi's office and announces in all seriousness that he is quitting his job. It's not just a layoff for Joe, it's a definitive break with his old life. He no longer wants to be part of a system that makes him suffer. Frank Vaturi, of course, can't understand what's going on. He tries to get Joe to change his mind, but his efforts are futile. Joe is relieved that he no longer has to please his boss. This decision becomes the beginning of his new life, albeit a tragic one. Joe decides to use the remaining months to do at least something significant that will make him feel alive. After being fired, Joe decides to go on a date with Dee Dee, a woman he once worked with. Their relationship was very brief, but Joe wants this meeting to be some sort of last chance for normal human companionship. He invites Dee Dee to dinner, and she agrees. But Joe feels that he needs to be honest with her, and at one point during dinner he reveals his diagnosis to her, telling her that he is dying of a terminal illness. This revelation becomes too much for Dee Dee to bear. She can't accept that Joe is about to die, and despite his suffering, she decides to leave him. This is another painful disappointment for Joe, but he doesn't feel surprised. He has long been used to his life being a series of failures and loneliness. After Dee Dee leaves, Joe finally realizes that he lacks meaning in his life. He decides to set out to find a new path. He feels that if his life is already doomed, he should at least try to do something meaningful. And then he comes across an ad for an opportunity to go to a tropical island. This island hides not only picturesque views, but also ancient rituals that are associated with local religion and beliefs. Once on the island, Joe meets a rich and mysterious millionaire who offers him not just a vacation, but to participate in a local ritual. According to ancient beliefs, every year someone must be sacrificed to a volcano in order to appease the god who supposedly inhabits the volcano and bring prosperity to the island. The millionaire tells Joe that his role is to become that sacrifice. For Joe, who has almost no time left, this becomes the last chance to do something important with his life. On this island, Joe meets a woman named Catherine, who becomes his guide and helper. She helps him get used to new conditions, familiarizes him with local customs and rituals. Through Catherine, Joe begins to realize that this trip is not just a last chance, but an opportunity to feel alive for a while, despite the inevitability of death. He and Catherine begin to become close, and this sense of closeness fills Joe with new emotions. He realizes that the life he once thought insignificant can actually be important if he learns to appreciate the moments it brings. When the day of the ritual arrives, Joe no longer feels like just a terminally ill man, but a man who has finally found some meaning. His decision to become a sacrifice to help the island and its people symbolizes his inner transformation. He is no longer afraid of death. Joe accepts this ritual not as a punishment, but as an opportunity to take the last step in his life for something bigger than himself. The movie ends with Joe essentially finding redemption and meaning in his death. His final steps show that even though his life has been filled with disappointment and suffering, he was able to find the strength to make one last act of selflessness. Joe passes away, but his act becomes a symbol of how important it is to appreciate every moment we have.